It is now time to draw the general conclusion of this Congress with Professor Phelps, 2006 Nobel Prize of Economics, who has opted for an 8-minute speech, followed by question and answers session, to be, as you asked, as reactive as possible vis-à-vis all what we heard up to now. Professor Phelps.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here in Brussels again, especially since I was here in Brussels just last May at a wonderful event at ULB. So thanks for inviting me again. Let me say a few words first about my views on the origins of the catastrophe. The speculative bubble that finally burst, unfortunately burst only after the housing industry had time to produce a massive oversupply of housing, and only after the banking industry had time to make a massive amount of bad loans, most of them on the books of the US banks. Behind the scenes of this bubble, though, I would say, was a little noticed decline in US innovation over the decade and a weakness in business investment. And the banks didn't help by their reorientation towards other things. I've been interested in a couple of provocative issues about the boom, and particularly the slump that followed. One is an old question about Austrian business cycle theory. Why was there a slump after the boom? Why wasn't there simply the end of the boom? Why not a controlled slide back down to the normal level of activity rather than a loop before getting back? In economic jargon, the question is, what would the economic equilibrium or the expectational equilibrium response to the oversupply of housing look like? Would it be just a moderation of the boom, ending in its disappearance, or would it be a slump? And the answer was that, at least in the models that I've been studying, that the expectational equilibrium, the path, the expectations of which would be self-fulfilling, is indeed a slump. And then working your way slowly back through recovery to the normal level. Now, two further developments, of course, need paying attention to. One is the outbreak of considerable amount of uncertainty, which further depressed the shadow price that businesses and you CEOs, and economists imagine that you CEOs are always putting shadow prices on business assets and investing accordingly. The shadow prices declined owing to the uncertainty. And then there was also the problem going downhill that prices were sticky, stickier than we'd like to see them, and that caused too much of that caused troubles to mount up along the way. And then to top it off, the Fed was a bit slow in creating the massive increase in liquidity that was indicated. However, I don't believe that it's correct to say that the Keynesian analysis is correct, that the whole story is one of deficient demand or excess supply. I think the problem was largely the Austrian problem of an oversupply of housing and an oversupply of bad loans and the accompanying uncertainty. Now, what lessons have been learned, and what can the government do? I do think that there's a certain amount of self-improvement going on. I would guess that private citizens will be wiser the next time around. Lots of lenders have been burned by Lehman, General Motors, or saved only by extraordinary intervention, as in Greece. I'm not sure about Wall Street. Wall Street's plagued by ruinous competition, decreasing costs, and so on, and problems of owner control. And I think we're very badly divided over what to do in many respects, not all. I like the idea of a revival of innovation, particularly in the U.S. economy, which has been the global leader in innovation. I like the idea of a revival of innovation in order to boost business investment in the U.S. and thus employment in the U.S. and to some extent in the world as a whole. But in the short run, that's not going to do. So how is the United States going to get back to a normal level of employment? In my view, the U.S. economy is badly wounded. It's wounded itself, that's true. But I take it we don't look for poetic justice here. We want to see a healthy global economy. So I think we need to see a full recovery of the American economy, not to the la-la days of 3.9% at the end of the 90s or even 4.6% unemployment rate in 1996 or in 2006 or 2007, but at least back to what was the normal unemployment rate in the mid-90s, like 5.5%. And I think the only way to get back to that, of course, is through more exports. And I think the world has to make a place for more exports by the United States if we're going to, in order to have, it's in their own interest, in order to have a revival of the U.S. Economy. Thank you very much.
Now, the first question that I would like to pose is not going to relate to your last point, which I think was very interesting and I'm sure would create lots of debate about the need for greater exports, and then all the discussion about the exchange rate, and would be, I think, some of the people in this room who feel on the receiving end with the high value of the euro at the moment may have some difficulties, although I personally would agree that there is very much a need for the US to have external demand in order to solve part of its problem. My question is going to be addressed to you not so much as a macroeconomist, but more as the founder or co-founder of the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University. Now, at the time of the break of the crisis, certainly in Europe, less in the US, I believe, but much more in Europe, there was sort of widespread criticism of capitalism. You know, the need to change the nature of capitalism. And at the very least, there was lots of emphasis on, or lots of distrust for markets. The view was that too much belief had been put on markets and on the rationality of markets, and that the crisis had proved that markets were irrational. The result of that was that there was probably a lot of call on intervention by public authorities in a number of areas, certainly back to the issues of consumer protection, and probably in part related to the financial sector. And clearly, I think there was much agreement on that. But I think it extended further than that. And we have heard a word that we had not heard for a long time, which is industrial policy. So an activist government in a number of areas, yes, in part related to energy, to environment, to sort of those longer-term problems that go beyond the crisis. So the question is, to what extent do you believe that public authorities should trust markets or instead be paternalistic in terms of consumer protection, in terms of industrial policy, in terms of innovation policy on which you have put so much emphasis?
Well, I brought my political economy hat with me, so I'm ready for the question. It seems that Europeans view every new development, and certainly every new crisis, as new evidence in favor of containing or even shutting down capitalism. In the 1830s, it was inequality. In the 1840s, it was employment swings. In the 1890s, it was the materialism of capitalism. In the 1820s, what was it? It was the lack of direction of capitalism. And, or maybe that's the 1810s. And then in the 1820s, it was even that productivity growth was too slow in some capitalist economies, such as Italy. We can do it better another way. That was always the feeling. A third way. As a result, Europe has long ago weakened and hamstrung the historic capitalism of dynamism and inclusiveness that began roughly in the 1820s, and which, by the way, Belgium was very much into right from the beginning. Now, about this alternative scenario of investment policy and energy and environment and so forth, I believe that there would be grave dangers in suffocating the historic capitalism, of the capitalism in which entrepreneurs seek to develop seek to develop new commercial ideas, and capitalists judge which ones of those projects are worth backing. I think that there will be a grave danger in ditching that system in favor of not capitalism, but let's call it environmentalism. I think that under that sort of a system in which the government is actively involved in consultation with scientists and other technical people in identifying and pushing new investment projects aimed at energy and the environment, I think that such a system in such a system, innovations would have far less of a chance of occurring. They would have far less of a chance of being heard. Who would you talk to? The president? That's one thing. And I also think that I don't like this system for other reasons also, besides innovation. I think that this environmentalist system would be largely driven by the career ambitions of scientists rather than by the relatively disinterested actions of CEOs in business companies. Certainly more humble. In short, an environmentalist system is really very much for the benefit of elites in society, while participation in a healthy capitalist system serves to involve the masses. It's wonderful for the grassroots and for personal development, personal growth on a wide scale.
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay, let's try and keep challenging you. Okay, it is true that indeed one impressive achievement of capitalist system is its ability to innovate. This being said, for years now, capitalism has also been accompanied by rising inequality. Not necessarily at the worldwide level, because a number of poor economies have become emerging, but clearly there has been rising inequality, at least within developed countries. And there is still massive inequality in poor countries. So given the limits facing redistributive taxation, due in particular to tax competition, tampering with free markets can be seen as an alternative way to redistribute. And so we are talking about public ownership. And one specific case would be, for example, the banking sector, where public ownership can be very important for governments to be able to manage financial inclusion policies. An excellent recent example is the case of India, where since 2006, the government has asked the Federal Reserve Bank of India to coordinate an access to finance policy using the 155,000 India post offices, extended to post banks, to help 70% of the Indian households to open bank accounts for the first time. In Western countries, too, there are very severe problems of financial exclusion, among immigrants, social dropouts, and so on, that could benefit from such an approach. Now, do you believe, beyond this example, but including that example, that redistribution in market economies should take place solely through taxation, possibly with stronger centralization policies to limit tax competition, or that limits to competition and regulation of key sectors could serve as adequate substitutes or complements to this mechanism?
Thank you. The question reminds me of the United States Post Office. I think the US Congress at one time had the bright idea to make the US Post Office system a kind of employer of last resort for disadvantaged workers, workers who could not find decent jobs in the private sector. So you saw a great swelling of the post office, heavily populated by disadvantaged groups. But then the law of unanticipated consequences kicked in. FedEx saw a great opportunity to go into the letter-carrying business, and UPS quickly expanded in the same direction. And of course, you have the German company's name escapes me. So the result probably is you have fewer jobs in the post office than you would have had if they hadn't given that big push. It's a kind of a lesson in how industrial policy and planning can go wrong. Now, let me say, though, that I'm something of an activist by the standards of the economics profession on this front. I do passionately advocate low-wage employment subsidies paid to companies for their ongoing employment of low-wage labor. And that, in my analysis, that would not only serve to pull up wages, it would also have a permanent, as long as it is in effect, it would have a permanent effect upon employment as well. You might well ask, well, if that's such a good idea, why has it never been adopted? One thing is it's too transparent. And another thing is I think the labor unions don't want to see an increase in wages and employment that they can't possibly take any credit for. And then I'm not sure that the companies are too keen on it either. So, sorry, I don't mean to look at you in particular. I'm just searching around for. And so it hasn't gotten anywhere. Except in Singapore. You know, in February 2009, when forecasters were saying that the unemployment rate is going to go from 3% to 9%, my colleague and sometime co-author, my co-author, Hyun-Taek Hoon, was there on the scene and helped them institute quickly a program of subsidies to companies to hang on, aimed at inducing them to hang on to their employees. I asked Jan Tech over the telephone after he told me about it, well, how long did it take to implement that scheme? And he said, oh, about 2 hours. You just had to reprogram the computer so that instead of taking Social Security contributions from the employees and the labor force, the government will throw money in the reverse direction to the companies. It was just very simple.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Phelps. I think it's a nice illustration that often the success, I think, of measures is in the detail. It's not just what you do, but how you do it. But I wanted to come to the bigger picture, maybe coming back to the macro picture. I guess, having been myself somewhat of a macroeconomist a long time ago, but ever since spending more time, let's say, on indeed questions of management and success at a company level, as I'm sometimes tempted to go back to my old love, if I can put it that way. And I would want to give you the option, if you wanted, to comment on how you see the, let's say, the contribution of macroeconomics versus, economists call it microeconomics or business management, in addressing issues like the crisis. But I would rather ask a more down-to-earth question, maybe. And it is more inspired by at least what I see happening, or what it seems to be also some part of the current discussions among business leaders, business media, and indeed economists and policymakers, is that on the one hand, there seems to be a lot of what should I say, fear, and a lot of reticence, a lot of reserve, or let's say muted expectations about the future. In fact, economic data on a macro level, we don't seem to be very convincing, indeed. And on the other hand, when talking and listening to many business leaders, even looking at the reported results, earnings reports, and so on, we hear more positive surprises than negative ones. So we seem to be looking at, in my view, at least in terms of perception, a growing, unprecedented gap between the macro picture and maybe the micro picture. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and what your feeling is, because my feeling is there, it means maybe we're just on the verge of a big takeoff, of a big recovery, the big recovery we've been waiting for, or is there still, or again, some crisis brewing, and we're on the verge of going down? What would it take to tilt the balance in favor of one as opposed to the other? Thank you.
Yeah, there is a gathering disconnect between what's happening to employment on the one hand and what's happening to output and profits on the other hand. I don't think the share of profits, talk about the US economy now, I don't think the share of profits is at a record high by any means, but it's certainly at a pretty high level. We had the same pattern, by the way, in the Great Depression. Output, beginning around 1933, the month I was born, output leaped ahead. The economy turned around sharply and was growing pell-mell until some monetary complications intervened in 1937-38, and there was a recession. During that period, employment surely increased, but it increased far more slowly than output. In other words, there was a fantastic growth of productivity. We could have that same thing going on here. in the present decade. What I think happened in the 1930s, I'm not a 30s scholar, but my hunch is that the business companies were still living off some of the major innovations that had occurred in the previous 2 or 3 decades, such as electrification, and that opened up all sorts of innovative possibilities, and they took advantage of them. One could argue that the age of the internet revolution, the communications revolution, is not yet over, and that it has another 10 years to run. I just saw an interesting chart in The Economist a couple of days ago in which the first innovation wave lasted about 50 years until the next one. That next one lasted about 40 years, and then the next one, the second one was electrification, the third one was something complicated, and then the fourth one is the internet revolution, and they kind of, the economist sort of extrapolates from imaginatively to conclude that this last innovative wave will have only 20 years to run. But that means it has another good 10 years to go. So, yes, it could happen that we're going to have a very bad time on the employment front, despite prosperity of companies. Which brings me back to my thought. We need low-wage employment subsidies to pick up employment. We also need investment tax credits to pick up investment activity. And I think we need a First National Bank of Innovation that will create a new, that will be a new entity that lends to or invests in companies wanting to embark on innovative projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Phelps. Even the best things have an end. And as far as this academic session is concerned, it is over. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we invite you to proceed to the dining room, we would like Mathias de Watripon, Joël Branson, and myself to express on behalf of our schools and their alumni our utmost gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Meneer Van Rompuy, Messieurs Lamy et Barnier, Mr. Paredes, Baudouin-Prot, and Professor Phelps, for their performance tonight. Although being squeezed by a very tight agenda, sorry again for that, but we thought it would help you to keep the audience captivated from the first to the last minute, all of you have enriched us deeply by the quality of your contributions, their complementarity, their profoundness, and your capacity to keep us out of breath, passionated. As free thinkers, we will leave it on everybody to make his or her own conclusion about what we have learned, or what we should have learned, what we still have to learn from this crisis, and take position on whether it is still going on, affecting society as a whole or not. But for sure, we feel authorized to enroll all the audience unanimously to express its thankfulness to you. Dear guests and participants, we now have a real challenge for you all. We promised you that you would leave at 11 p.m., although leaving you, of course, all the night for networking afterwards. To achieve that, we kindly ask you to proceed to your tables and be seated at latest at 9:35. Due to an unexpected change in the official program of the visit to Belgium of Monsieur Nazarbayev, President of Kazakhstan, His Royal Highness le Prince Philippe de Belgique attends the dinner offered tonight by His Majesty King Albert and will have the pleasure to host Princess Mathilde, who by her presence not only honors our dinner, but demonstrates the interest of the royal family for education and for our schools. For reasons linked to protocol and security, we insist you should be seated when Princess Mathilde, accompanied by our guest at the honor table, will join you at 9:40 p.m. latest. We all owe recognition and respect to the team who made this event possible and organized it. I feel personally indebted towards Marie, Laetitia, Alexandra, both Caroline, Fabienne, Sophie, Michael, and last but not least, Nicolas Van Brandt, for their dedication and their help. Thank you. May we, together with Mathias de Watripon, Dean of the Solvay Brussels School of Economics and Management, and Joël Branson, Dean of the Solvay Business School, invite you to proceed to the dining room now. Thank you again for your presence, and wishing you all the best for the rest of this evening. We are pleased to fix the dates of our next appointments, our big events 2012 and 2014, and of course, our next Congress in 2016. See you then.